Let me start with a simple memory. One that belongs to no single person, yet somehow belongs to everyone who grew up in the 1970s. Imagine a warm evening, the kind where the streetlights haven't turned on yet, but the sky has already begun to dim. You can hear laughter from somewhere down the block. You can hear a distant radio playing a song that everyone seemed to know by heart. There is no buzzing phone, no digital alert, no tidal wave of information waiting to be checked. Just voices, just moments, just presence. For many people who grew up in the 1970s, that was life. Unfiltered, uninterrupted, a kind of quiet that doesn't quite exist anymore. But here's the part almost no one talks about. The 1970s created a type of psychology that's becoming harder and harder to find in the modern world. A mindset shaped by freedom and responsibility, by risk and resilience, by a strange mixture of uncertainty and stability. And as we compare it to the generation who grew up after the year 2000, something fascinating happens. The differences don't just tell us about time, they tell us about the human mind itself. So let's explore something that might change the way you think about your childhood, your habits, and even your own reactions to the world around you. Because the truth is, the decade we grow up in leaves fingerprints on the way we think for the rest of our lives. People who grew up in the 1970s often talk about their childhood like it was another planet. And in some ways, it was. A world without constant surveillance, without cameras on every corner, without parents tracking their children's locations every 5 minutes. Kids rode their bikes miles from home, sometimes with no destination at all. They climbed trees, built forts, scraped their knees, and learned lessons not because someone taught them, but because real life did. And whether they realized it or not, this created a psychological foundation that shaped the rest of their lives. But here's the part that might surprise you. Many psychologists say that the environment you grow up in, especially between the ages of 7 and 14, shapes your stress responses, your ability to handle uncertainty, and even your tolerance for boredom. And in the 1970s, boredom wasn't something to be avoided. It was a natural part of childhood. You waited for the TV program you liked. You waited for the one phone in the house to be free. You waited for your friend to return home because there was no way to message them. That waiting built patience, imagination, and a kind of mental stillness that is becoming rare today. Now compare that to people born after the 2000s. Their world began vibrating with notifications before they even learned how to write their name. Attention, once a natural part of human experience, became something constantly interrupted. A generation raised on instant everything, instant search results, instant entertainment, instant distractions, instant validation. It created a psychological environment where quiet feels uncomfortable and boredom feels like a problem that needs solving, rather than a natural space where creativity grows. But here is where things get even more interesting. One generation was shaped by external silence. The other was shaped by internal noise. And this creates two very different ways of processing life. People from the 1970s often talk about a kind of emotional sturdiness, not because life was easier, but because life required it. If you fell, you got back up. If something broke, you tried to fix it. If the world felt uncertain, you adapted. The psychology built from that era created a sense of self-reliance, sometimes too much of it, sure, but genuine, grounded resilience. Meanwhile, many young people today grew up with constant input, constant comparison, and constant reminders that someone else somewhere is living a more exciting life. And even though technology brought incredible opportunities, it also created invisible pressure. Pressure to be seen, pressure to respond, pressure to stay updated, pressure to keep up, and pressure, when it never stops, reshapes the mind in ways people are only now starting to understand. But before we go further, let me open a small curiosity loop. Something that might explain a lot about why these two generations feel so different. There is a psychological phenomenon called environmental permanence. It means that when you grow up believing the world is stable, predictable, and safe, your mind reacts to challenges with calm adaptability. But when you grow up in an environment of rapid change, where technology, norms, trends, and expectations constantly shift, your mind becomes sharper in some ways, but also more sensitive in others. Now here's the interesting part. The 1970s weren't truly stable. There were political shifts, global worries, economic challenges, and major cultural changes. But those changes weren't hitting the brain every 30 seconds through a glowing screen. They unfolded slowly, like chapters in a book instead of flashes on a timeline. And because of that, many people from that decade learned how to absorb life at a human pace, not a digital pace. People who grew up after the 2000s often absorb life at something closer to a digital speed. And the truth is, the mind wasn't originally designed for that. But before we dive deeper into this contrast, let's stay a little longer with the 1970s generation. Because there is something profoundly symbolic about the way they grew up, something that quietly shaped their emotional wiring. Think about the silence of walking home from school, the long stretches of time with nothing but your own thoughts, the friendships built face to face, not through screens, the arguments resolved not through blocked numbers but through uncomfortable conversations that forced emotional maturity. People from the 1970s learned social cues not through emojis, but through tone, posture, eye contact, pauses. This created a generation with strong intuition, not because they were born with it, but because they practiced it every single day. There's a type of strength that comes from having fewer safety nets. Not because life was perfect, but because life required you to be present. You learn to handle discomfort. You learn to talk through disagreements. You learn to survive boredom, disappointment, uncertainty. And those experiences built a psychology that feels almost foreign in today's world. But here's the twist. Even though this generation built resilience, they often developed something else too. Something rarely discussed: emotional privacy. Because without digital communication, people grew up keeping more thoughts inside. And that shaped a quieter inner world that many still carry today. Meanwhile, the generation born after the 2000s grew up expressing everything, sharing everything, posting everything. Their identities formed not just internally, but externally, through constant feedback. And while that can build confidence, it can also create something fragile, the feeling that your worth depends on being visible. There's one more fascinating difference between these two generations, one that psychologists call perceived autonomy. People from the 1970s often grew up having to make independent decisions at a very young age: what time to come home, how to handle conflict, how to entertain themselves. Without an endless stream of instructions or reminders, they learned to manage their time, energy, and emotions without assistance. People born after the 2000s often grew up with structure, guidance, and digital tools that solved problems instantly. Navigation apps, reminder notifications, online help, constant communication. This created a generation that is incredibly resourceful, connected, and technologically intelligent, but with a different relationship to independence. Now, here's where everything becomes even more interesting. If you place these two generations in the same conversation, one shaped by silence, one shaped by stimulation, you start to notice contrasts, not just in mindset, but in the rhythm of life itself. One generation trusts the slow process. The other trusts speed, adaptability, and innovation. One generation built boundaries through experience. The other builds boundaries through online awareness and emotional vocabulary. One learned resilience by facing life directly. The other learns resilience by managing information overload. But here's the real question: which generation had it harder? And the answer might surprise you. Because the more you look at it, the more you realize each generation faced its own kind of challenge. The 1970s demanded physical freedom, but emotional restraint. The modern era demands emotional expression, but mental endurance. In a world with fewer distractions, people had more space to think, but also more space to worry. In a world with constant stimulation, people have more tools, but also more pressure. And this leads to the most important realization of all. Every generation adapts to the world they are born into, whether that world moves slowly or at the speed of light. But before we reach the real heart of this, there's something deeper we haven't explored yet. Something that might explain not only how people think today, but why they feel the way they do. And that part of the story begins in a place most of us rarely look. Because the truth is, the psychology of a generation isn't built from the things they remember. It's built from the things they didn't realize were shaping them. And for people who grew up in the 1970s, one of those hidden forces was space. Not outer space, the quiet space of an unplanned afternoon, the open space of a neighborhood without constant supervision, the emotional space to figure things out before sharing them with anyone else. That space created an inner world that often feels steadier, slower, and more rooted. A type of mind that pauses before reacting, that thinks before speaking, that can go an entire afternoon without needing noise to feel comfortable. But here's a question to consider. What happens to a mind raised with space when it enters a world that no longer has any? That's the conflict many people from that decade feel today, even if they can't fully explain it. They grew up in a world that rewarded patience, but now live in a world that rewards speed. They grew up with long conversations, but now live in a world of short messages. They grew up valuing presence, but now spend every day surrounded by distractions engineered to divide their attention. And somewhere in that collision between past and present, they develop a unique kind of quiet resilience, a resilience that comes not from keeping up with the world, but from remembering a time when life moved differently and realizing it's still okay to move at that rhythm. But let's turn the lens for a moment.